Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We are talking with Shea Brown. And Shea is the CEO of a company that focuses on AI auditing called BABL AI. Um, and we're here to talk to him about AI auditing. What's the need for it? Why is it a hot topic? Why is it important? What is it? And really excited to have you here today, Shea. You have a very interesting background. Like you're also a professor now at the University of Iowa for physics, correct?
That's right. Yeah, physics and astrophysics, and
Yeah.
uh, and my PhD is in astrophysics, which is not related to algorithmic auditing, uh, but surprisingly useful for it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I kind of wanted to just briefly ask that question. How did you get into this field of algorithmic auditing from that place?
Yeah, good question. So it's totally random. Uh, so I use AI for my research. So
Hmm.
just it's impossible given the amount of data we get from the sky now. It would be impossible even if every human on Earth was doing nothing but staring at that data. We look at through it all. So
Sure.
it sort of necessitates the need for some sort of automation of that process. So I do that for my research, and I got interested in starting a business related to that. I felt like it was a really important, urgent thing. And during this was around 2018, and this is also around the time that the ProPublica report came out talking about
Oh,
biased recidivism algorithms,
okay.
Cambridge Analytica, the power of algorithms to affect our society. And I felt like algorithmic auditing was one way that I could contribute. My brain sort of went there naturally. And I also knew a lot of philosophers and ethicists. And I thought this is a perfect area where I could kind of carve out a little piece of this, of trying to solve this, what seemed to be a really important puzzle and challenge.
Oh, that's great. I love that story. And I mean, like sitting here on this side of it, I'm like, well, thank goodness, because I think we need people like you that are like pointing their brains into that direction. So
Yeah, and
great.
it's becoming more and more, as you say, a hot topic. And so at that time it was not, and it's sort of not, it's gratifying to me that people are now realizing that it is something that as a potential solution to some of these problems, and that we thinking hard about how we need to do it and what's the correct way to do it, and are there better or worse ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and maybe a good place to start. And I know, I've been saying AI auditing, but, there's this vernacular thing around this, right? What is AI relative to algorithms, relative to machine learning? And my caveat in this conversation is when I say AI auditing or this auditing process we're talking about, it really encapsulates all of that as well as auto decision making, I assume. Is that a fair assumption on my part to make going into this conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it in my mind, and I think in a lot of people's mind, it doesn't really matter what the underlying technology is necessarily. It's just the automation of decision making that has sort of that makes consequential decisions about humans, whether
Yeah.
that be an autonomous vehicle or some sort of machine learning about whether you get a job or not. That the actual technology itself, it's more the automation and the way it makes a decision about a human that is kind of important.
Yeah. Great. Great. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense to me. So can you kind of set the stage a little bit? Like how would you define what it is and what well, maybe just what it is and why it's
Yeah,
there. That
yeah,
would be really helpful.
yeah. This is an interesting question that does need to get answered because what is an algorithm audit or what is an AI audit? And I think the broad way to think about it is that we know that these systems, these automated systems, whether they be AI or some other kind of algorithm, are used in ways that could potentially harm people. Like they're making decisions about people, they are informing humans' decisions about people. And in some cases, like autonomous vehicles, for instance, they could directly impact, no pun intended, people. And so
Yeah.
the what we mean by auditing in this case is that uh, we are trying to assess these systems for the potential risk to humans, and whether they are more or less risky, and whether there's a way that we can sort of mitigate that. Now, people have different ways of thinking about this, and some people think that an audit is, that kind of risk assessment. And there's a whole literature on what an algorithmic risk assessment is, or impact assessment, and that's one way of uncovering these potential harms. But I
Mm-hmm.
think the way in which regulation and the community is moving towards understanding the term AI audit or algorithm audit is a little bit more closer akin to like financial audit, where there's some set of standards. So let's say we've sort of identified potential risks. There's a set of standards of best practices that companies that use or develop or deploy these tools should follow. And that what auditing is doing is to ensure that these companies or these systems sort of adhere to these standards. And so
Mm.
there's a bit of distinction between those, and I think people will use the term back and forth. But I think of risk and impact assessments, which include things like technical testing for bias or accuracy, to
Sure.
be on the side of identifying the potential for risk. And then the audit side is more of, we have a set of standards. Let's make sure that people are adhering, or systems adhere to those standards.
Yeah, and there's kind of like two questions that kind of pop out at me automatically, which is like, I guess the first one I'll bring up is the risk to whom? Like, is it because there's a risk to the people it's affecting, and then there's risk to the business. And I'm assuming most of what we're talking about is risk to the people it's affecting, and you have to first sort of define that, correct?
Yeah. So that's a distinction that it's important to make. And I think the way that we approach this, so we actually wrote a paper in 2020. It was called The Algorithm Audit, was the actual title of the paper. But what it really was focusing on was the risks, the humans,
Mm,
including stakeholders like the business, or the people who use the tool, or the people who sell the tool, not just the impacted people at the other end. And I think it is important to consider all those stakeholders, but the primary stakeholder I think that most people are thinking of are the impacted ones at the other end of the algorithm,
right. Yeah.
partly because they are the most vulnerable, and they have the least power. And sort of in general, those who have less power are more likely to be harmed, full stop. And
Right.
so it
Yeah.
just makes sense that they're the first ones you target. And then, of course, there are other business risks or reputational risks or liability risks that sort of will flow from that
Mm,
naturally. But the main priority, at least for us, is the impacted stakeholder.
yeah. No, that makes sense. But then it gets me into the space where, my background is I spent a couple of years really interested in ecology, and geology and stuff, and the number of parameters you have to deal with is just insane. And so I kind of come to these things with that sort of mental model. And so how do you distill down? Because when I think about, wow, the risks of an algorithm, to try and like do a comprehensive list of it almost feels impossible. And then there's the question of the risk that can't even be measured. So for
Yeah.
example, the risk of bias when you're not even collecting the data around a particular kind of bias. Those types of things, like how do you kind of negotiate distilling down a reasonable set of risk that's going to be full enough but not overwhelming?
Yeah. So this is the big challenge in uh, defining those standards. Defining what are the risks that should be considered, who is considered, what are the potential
Oh,
features.
so the standards you were talking about before was also to define the risks. Is that what you're
Yeah,
saying?
yeah. So to some extent, I think there's no way of getting around the fact that you need to do, you meaning, let's say, company X that is, or organization X that is deploying one of these tools. There's no way of getting around having to consider risks that are sort of bespoke to your use case.
Mm,
And you can't expect a standard to cover everything. And
right.
so there's no way of getting around it. More likely, the standard would require, and it does in a lot of cases, require you to do that risk assessment.
Mm,
And oftentimes, the auditor, for instance, would be checking that you have done a risk assessment according to those, some standards, some criteria.
hmm,
But the point still stands. You're right. in the process of doing that risk assessment, it is not easy to know that you have covered everything. And in fact, you can be almost, the only thing you can be confident about is you didn't cover everything.
Yeah.
And so the way we have a specific methodology at BABL, and this was part of the publication, to try to systematically attack that problem by identifying relevant stakeholders, thinking in terms of interests and what interests they have. You could also think about it in terms of harms, and then trying to connect those interests and the potential for the algorithm to potentially infringe upon those interests, and what features of identifying what features of the socio-technical system, not necessarily the algorithm per se, but also how somebody uses it or interprets it,
Oh, right. Yeah.
could affect those interests. And there are always going to be gaps. And this is a big part of why you need diversity, for instance, of thought when you do this process. You got to have people in the room, because if you don't have the right people in the room, somebody's perspective is going to get missed. Some potential sort of piece of the parameter space, which is critical for risk, will get missed. And so that's why part of the standards should require this diversity of thought in these risk assessment processes, because you're right, you can easily let something slide, or some black swan event that just, that you may not have foreseen might pop up. But if you had somebody in the room that had some lived experience around a particular risk area, that could potentially be caught.
Yeah, and this might be a little bit of a tangent of a question, but I want to ask it because this is something I've been a little bit passionate about, particularly in the last few years, is because I imagine the people in the room are stakeholders and technical people, most likely, and auditors, right? Not necessarily the consumers. But something I've been really interested in, and I don't know how to solve this problem, but is how do you make those groups more diverse? Like having a diverse team of developers and stakeholders that can, because some of the things I imagine you have to look for in these audits is certain types of bias or user harm or user intentions you don't mean, that no one in that room is going to think about because they're not part of a specific kind of group.
Yeah. This is,
And
go ahead.
I don't know. That was, and I know it's a little bit of a tangent. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but that's a thought I have when you're saying that, is like, I know if it's a bunch of people in the room, they all have the same demographic. There's certain things they're just not going to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is you don't know blind spots. I mean, that's why they're kind of called blind spots. And I think it's very difficult for people to get the perspective in a company. So especially depending on your size, especially imagine a startup, right, that has some great idea for a use of AI in a particular use case. There's 7 employees, and they all of a sudden need to think about this risk assessment, and they're all from the same university, the same demographic, and they're just sitting around in a room trying to theorize about what other people's problems are, what could potentially be risky. And so this is a very hard problem, even for like enterprise clients that might have resources to come, to try to reach out to these communities. And so there's no easy answer for this. And I think the key is, as you say, hire people who are diverse. Well, an individual person's not diverse. Hire a diverse collection of people.
Right.
Get them in the room, and when you decide to engage in something like a risk assessment, your first thought should be, how can I draw from as many perspectives as I can within my own company to start this conversation?
Right.
And people in product, people in the data science, the development, people who manage the data, getting the data, people who are selling to clients, of course, the C-suite. Get everybody you can, because they're all going to have different perspectives. And then the question. So one thing that we encourage is to always ask yourself the question: who's not in the room? Like, what are we missing?
Oh, yeah.
And we have assumptions. When you put things up on a whiteboard about assumptions of potential risks, there are going to be things that you could potentially go validate your assumptions by going and talking to people.
Right.
And part of the risk assessment should be assessing how much don't I know about this particular group that could potentially be impacted, and do I need to find out about it in order to progress, or are my assumptions pretty safe and I can proceed safely with a Google search about potential incidences that might have happened, or do I need to actually go talk to people? And
Right.
and anyway, so there's no easy way to answer that, but I think you're right. Getting as many people with different perspectives in the same room is one way of sort of at least mitigating that.
Yeah. Yeah. No kidding. Interesting. So that kind of leads me into a different sort of place that I think you touched on just briefly, which is like because it's such an interesting intersection between social or mental models and technical application. And I know even for myself as a data scientist not doing audits, that's the hardest part of my job is that intersection. And then when you're in this context, um, I can imagine it being extra hard, right? So,
Yeah.
that social technical sort of spectrum of people, um, what's that experience like for you in this auditing framework?
Yeah. So let me pull back to the actual auditing part in a
Great.
second.
Sorry.
So
Yes. I'm
no, that's okay, because there are two, like, but the problem exists in both spaces. So one space is like what the companies are doing in terms of trying to identify that risk, and then also what are we doing to try to audit those companies that are
Oh,
trying.
yeah. Okay.
And so,
Sure.
but we also have to have that diverse perspective as well, and we have to have diverse sort of technical and socio-technical, or technical and sort of social and legal perspectives, which I think is what you're getting at. And so, for instance, one way in which we tackle this is that um, if we do a risk assessment for another company, let's forget auditing even for a second. If we do a risk assessment for another company, we always have to have a technical person on that risk assessment team.
Mm,
But it's driven mostly by the lawyers, the ethicists, the social scientists. They're the ones who are driving the process.
mm,
But the data scientist or the technical person, it has to be on that team, and that person has to be able to communicate the relevant technical details in order for us to do an effective risk assessment. And so it's actually kind of a unique skill set to be a person who has enough technical skills to know how a large language model works, or know what a recommender system and what multi-arm bandits are, or whatever, but also be able to communicate that to a bunch of ethicists or lawyers or anthropologists in a way that targets what's risk relevant, because
mm.
not all of those technical details are relevant for risk. Some of
Oh,
them are, and it's not obvious which ones are which. And so what we've learned is that it's only that kind of experience is gained through practice.
sure.
And so you need to have those cross-functional teams working through problems together. And the ethicists or the socio people are going to ask tough questions of this technical person to force them into a clear understanding of why does it matter uh, what threshold I set on this classifier, and why false positive rates versus false negative rates is relevant, and what does that actually mean, and how does that translate to real harm.
Right.
And so that's a really interesting dynamic that we've seen play out time and time again now. And the fact is there's a lot of missing skills that are hard to come by, but I think are going to be critically important as we move forward into a world where AI is doing a lot of the work and humans are doing a lot of babysitting of the AI.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that resonates deeply with me. I mean, it's great to hear. Actually, that dynamic sounds so interesting and kind of fun, actually, to me, weirdly. But um, I have the same challenge in my job. Like that's the hardest skill to find, someone who can do that. Because usually business stakeholders, it's a similar thing where they want to know what the algorithms are doing. They want to understand how their decisions impacted the model, things like that. But it's like that on steroids for you, I think,
Yeah.
for what you're talking about. So
Well, it's probably not too dissimilar, because I think there's, yeah, you want to be able to understand. It's the explainability bit or the interpretability bit where it's what's going on under the hood just enough so that I know what to trust. I know um, the extent to which these outputs of these systems should inform my good judgment, and that takes some skill. and some practice.
Yeah. So how do you handle things like, because there's layers of interpretability and explainability, transparency, and so for some for some statistical models or algorithms, it's very clear because you've sort of defined things sort of mathematically and specifically. And then there's, like deep learning where there might be things going on that no one knows. We can't necessarily extract it. It doesn't mean that we don't know anything. It just means we can't say it made this decision for this reason. And so, how do you manage that or handle that?
Yeah. So luckily we have people on our team who it's their job to think about that sort of explainability for whom. Like we have people who work on for instance, the ethics of autonomous weapons and in scenarios like this, or like targeting systems, or things where it's sometimes in some cases is important for certain stakeholders to know the direct reasoning that the algorithm used to give a particular output,
Mm,
because that reasoning might have legal or moral implications.
right.
But there are other cases, and for other stakeholders, that an approximation is okay. Like if I know that, let me use just an example from autonomous weapons for a second. Let's
Sure.
say I have there's some drone that's targeting some strike, and there's an overhead video camera of somebody carrying something that on their shoulder that the drone identifies as a weapon, right?
Mm, okay.
One thing I might want to know is uh, that, to me, when I look at that footage, I might think that could be a rolled up carpet. That doesn't have to be a bazooka or something like this, right? I'm using a very, hopefully it's not triggering anyone, but this is a sort of a real scenario that could happen.
Right.
What do I need to know? I might know as a human who's assessing this that this is a part of the world where people are carrying around carpets like that. It's not abnormal to have that happen. So, but the algorithm might have other things that it's using to identify this as a combatant.
Right.
I might want to know what is, for interpretability, what is the most significant parts of this scene that you think are relevant for this person being a combatant. And if you only highlight in bright red that carpet they have or whatever it is they have on their shoulder, I might start worrying that if that's all you're relying on, this is not relevant. We need to double check what's going on. Now, if
Right.
there are other things, right? There's the neighborhood it's in, the patterns of activity that might be coming from another piece of the algorithm, other kind of intel. Okay, then that's a different story, and then you have different courses of action you might take.
Sure.
That's the kind of thing, like you have to know what the stakeholder who's getting that explanation needs to make an informed decision, and whether it's important to know all the details or just some of the details. And
Right.
that's just one example, and it plays out time and time again in different scenarios. And so it does take a really a perspective from a particular use case, and not just a particular use case, a particular stakeholder who has to get that explanation.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. And that was a great example because I can very much see how it kind of amplifies the different examples where you would want to know specifically how decisions are being made or what's informing a decision.
Yeah, probably a less scary example, of course, would be loan, whether you give somebody a loan or not, and those kind of explanations are probably I should have gone with that one. But in any case, it is relevant. Like there are certain legal requirements that you can't, if this had something to do with your zip code,
Sure.
and that was the primary feature that this thing is relying on, then that we know that that's probably likely discriminatory given the correlation between zip code and things like race.
Right. Yeah. 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 Great. So maybe we could get a little bit into like why we're even here. Like why are we talking about this? Like what's the landscape? Can we dig into that a little bit? Because I think most of what I know is more local to the US. I'm in Seattle, hearing about what's going on in New York. And then in my work, I hear about it more and more and socially. But I'd love to hear your perspective of like where we're at in.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that the reason we're talking about this mostly is because of the sort of the number of incidences that have happened where AI has been used in ways that were harmful, potentially biased or discriminatory, dangerous, privacy invading. And so that's the primary reason. And what that has motivated is a lot of risk for companies. And um, the first wave of risk that has happened over the past few years has been sort of reputational and liability risk. And
Right.
that has already been driving a lot of discussions about these audits. That wave is not stopping. However, regulatory risk is now popping its head up. And so what we're seeing is that there are a lot of laws in the US at the local level. So things like New York City's local law 144, which is now requiring for systems like that you might use to hire candidates that apply for jobs, these sort of employment decision tools, as they call them. They actually are requiring with this law that they get audited for bias in this case.
Right.
There are a number of other laws that are being proposed. New Jersey has some in the DC area or Washington, DC. They have the Stop Discrimination by Algorithm Act. At the federal level, there was the Algorithmic Accountability Act, which sort of died, but it, it pops its head up every now and then. It gets resubmitted. And other laws in the US, which are forcing people to either do these audits or to seriously consider the possibility that in the near future, they're going to have to be audited for something, either for risk management. In the case of Colorado's law for insurance companies, that they have to have a risk management framework that they've implemented, and they might need to be audited against that, or for technical things like bias or disparate impact. In the EU, there's a whole bunch of other things going on. And so I'll quickly say that the Digital Services Act has passed. That is regulating large platforms, small platforms as well, that like social media platforms or search engines. So all the big Microsoft, Google, Facebook, all the people who have these kind of platforms are going to have to be audited against compliance. And then the EU AI Act has a huge number of requirements, and that will require anybody who wants to be selling any high-risk AI in the European Union to go through what's called a conformity assessment. Think about it like an audit. And so that's kind of forcing this conversation about, what do we even mean by this audit, and what are the requirements, and how should they be conducted?
Yeah, and it's interesting where I'm sitting right now, because actually the company I work for, Colligo, we're headquartered in the EU side of the pond, and so we're compliant to a lot of those things, right? In that sense, like those laws. And then, but I live in the US, and most of my experience has been in the US. And I sort of wonder, it's so interesting because on the other side of the pond, it's like, kind of like a unified front is what it feels like. We're having a unified front of standards and regulations, things that need to be implemented. They're like, okay, we're going to do this. It needs to be implementable within this amount of time, like very reasonable in that sense. And then in the US, it feels kind of like random pop-ups that I don't have a great sense of how, like, it seems like we're just at the beginning. And even I was reading an article about the one in New York, I think recently, that sort of brought to question how concrete it will be, in the sense of, is it going to actually be a really good foundation for what the standards need to be? Or is it kind of more of a, what do you call that, branding thing?
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, and I know that it's evolving and moving, but we don't have that same unified front in a lot of different ways, but specifically in this way, it's interesting to think about it that way.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the approaches are kind of complementary in a way. Like the European approach right now is very top down, and they're coming up with this sort of monolithic digital services package, which is like GDPR, that was going to, similar to GDPR, where it has a scope that's going to cover the whole, the Brussels effect. And but the problem with that is its uh, its attempt at being comprehensive could also be a liability, because what happens in reality is that once you have it's mostly about being able to move goods and services around Europe. And
Mm,
what happens is, once you set up this sort of monolithic requirements, which will be kind of very onerous in the beginning, um, it becomes kind of static in the sense that you get a conformity assessment and then you can just start selling anywhere you want. And
mm,
it's not necessarily as flexible as what's happening in the US. And what's happening in the US, while it's true that these laws that are popping up some will be more effective than others.
right.
What it's doing is it's forcing companies to react to these risks in quickly. And
Yeah.
like New York is coming before EU AI Act, coming before anything. And this is, in some cases, is the first instance that some of these companies have had to deal with this. And so it's like the sharp end of the spear, where it's like all of a sudden we have to start worrying about what a disparate impact testing looks like, or what a risk assessment might look like, or what kind of governance we might need. And I think the nimbleness of sort of the local regulation in the US, while it can be very annoying for companies, it actually does allow for some input from uh, interested sort of community stakeholders,
Sure.
and allows for that, you to get at some harms that may get missed if you try this monolithic approach.
If you
I
like
think,
grow from the ground up sort of more, you're getting more input from the people who are developing it to an extent. Is that what you mean by that kind of?
yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. I mean, there's also the danger, of course, it can get corrupted by kind of corporate, but there's nothing that's going to stop that from happening. It happens in the EU, it happens in the
Yeah.
US, and so, um, but what I'm saying is that I think it's okay to have these sort of patchwork laws, at least right now, because it's going to be a testing ground for what the EU is going to do. And
Sure.
I think the EU is watching. I know for a fact the EU is watching closely what happens with these local laws, and what audits look like there, what the requirements are, what's the aftermath,
Yeah.
in terms of the liability landscape. And I think they can learn things from that, and that would be a good thing. And hopefully the more monolithic structures they come up with in Europe uh, are better because of it.
Sure. Yeah. Oh, that's an interesting perspective, and it makes a lot of sense. It also makes it feel more like a human problem,
Yeah,
to an extent, we're in it together.
yeah, yeah. We're all working together. But I mean, I think there are dynamics that will play out. Like, I have a strong interest in the algorithmic auditing community doing well, and I think it's the U.S. is. It's if I were a policymaker in the U.S. looking at what might happen in Europe, do I really want all of the auditors to be sort of Europe to be dominating that space? Because it's going to be a big business. If you think about this, this is just the beginning, and
Sure.
we're going to
Yeah.
be running everything on algorithms. And at some point, we're going to have those algorithms audited and tested and ensured that they're safe. And so this will be a massive financial auditing size industry.
Yeah.
And do we want Europe to be the one that has all of the major players in that?
Sure.
I don't
Yeah.
think the US is interested in having that. I think there's enough pie to go around. So let's make sure that the US market is nurtured.
Sure.
And so I think there's that. Of course, this is unbiased opinion because I'm part of this
Sure, of
ecosystem.
course,
So
but I get it. That makes sense.
yep.
So if we kind of linger for a minute specifically on the New York stuff that's going on, because and I got a little confused because it seems like it evolved, right? Because I think at first, can you give a little timeline and how it's evolved? Because I think as I'm reading the news, it's a little bit confusing because it seems like it's been adjusting and
Yeah,
sort of.
it's absolutely confusing. Yeah, this is the growing pains of, because this is the first time. So a little bit of history. This is the New York City Council. It's a local law for the city, passed or proposed a law. The original law, as it was proposed, was meant to apply to vendors of these systems. When I say these systems, I mean the tools that are used to like decide whether you pass through a CV screener, so to speak, or a resume screener,
Right.
among other things. These employment tools. It was meant to be applied to vendors who create these, because employers, the ones who use them, uh, they are already subject to the EEOC guidelines, like they have for anti-discrimination law,
Oh,
right?
right. Totally.
So they're already subject to that in some sense. And this was meant to kind of fill a gap. Like, what about the vendors? There should be some obligations on them. The law changed for whatever reason, and when it passed, it became put on the employers again. So it was the employers that were required, and one of the requirements is to have a bias audit done, and it had to be independent. Somebody else had to do it; couldn't be the employer. In the law itself, there was a lot of the details were left to the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection to provide regulations, like more detailed guidelines. And so what you're being confused by is that they have basically been putting out a series of these rules. And there's been so much dynamic input from the community. Like I was at the first, I testified at the first sort of like rulemaking session
Okay.
of 3 or 4. And there was like maybe 20 people there.
So all from the algorithm auditing community.
No, I was the only person.
We're the only person there. Oh, wow.
Well, there one other person from For Humanity who showed up, but
Okay.
besides that, it was a bunch of lawyers, really.
Wow. Okay.
And they didn't. Nobody really spoke. There was a couple of us. There's a professor from NYU, a very famous professor who does a lot of really great work. She spoke. I spoke, and this other person from this other nonprofit spoke, and then nobody else did. Then the rules actually got put out that had all the details about what was required, which includes a lot of like public information that has to come out in these audit reports. And then they literally broke Zoom because there are so many people that showed up to it. And so there's been a huge amount of pushback. And so the rules have kind of gone all over the place. And it's still all over the place. And so the final rules have not been actually settled on.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
So that's where we're at, and so it's not clear who the auditors are supposed to be. It's not clear what's going to be disclosed. There's a lot of things that are still kind of up in the air about this, and the deadline is April 15th currently.
Okay, but it is being sort of constructed with, I can't tell. Is it being constructed with a wide breadth of, like you were saying, you spoke and a lawyer from NYU spoke, and is that contributing to it?
Yes, so the public comments are being considered,
Okay.
and since that first meeting, a lot of people are now speaking. So luckily, a lot of people from the community, like from the community, are speaking. People
Oh,
who
good.
in New
Okay.
York, from nonprofits and from consumer advocates and things like this are speaking, and businesses as well. And
I mean,
so,
that's pretty cool. It's like a true democratic decision to an extent.
well, yeah, we'll find out at the end what actually gets considered and what doesn't.
Sure.
Uh, but it's just it's the growing pains of something that's brand new. There has not been requirements like this for. It's kind of like the first algorithmic auditing for like these AI systems that's being required to be made public. And
Right.
so there's a lot of fear around it, and there's a lot of uncertainty. And so we'll see. This, like I said, is going to be growing pains and a learning experience for potentially the EU to gain some insight.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. I'm excited to keep an eye out, and we'll see if the April 15 deadline actually gets met.
Yeah, exactly.
That's great. So that that leads me to another interesting thing, like taking the New York stuff aside, like because from where I'm sitting, whether a business has self-interest in doing these types of things to kind of monitor and audit themselves or through regulation on the EU side. I know that people, when they first start talking about it, the first thing they feel is intimidated. It's going to be expensive. We have no idea what we're doing. Like that's my general sense of what their initial guttural reaction is to something like this. And so,
Yeah.
I just wanted to take a minute to see, like, what would you like recommend for people, or what do you think is a good way for people to begin that journey?
Yeah, this is it can be intimidating because there's a lot. And if you try to look up what are frameworks for ethical AI, or you're going to get so many different things and so many different opinions. And if you look at regulations, you're going to see that there's so many popping up, and it's hard to tell what's going on. However, there is a clear set of sort of best practices, which all of everything is going to require. And so our take on it is focus on those few things that you need to do, and then get that foundation, and then you expand from there. So what do I mean by that? There has to be someone in your organization who is responsible for this. This meaning the oversight of the risks associated with these tools. And so the very first thing is
Oh,
get a person who is responsible. So
you mean
if
you
you're
want someone who's accountable?
yeah, get an accountable person. And
Sure.
it sounds silly as a first step, but this
Makes sense.
people have to do this, and so there needs to be people that are doing it. And so whoever it is, say, okay, Sarah, it's your job.
Right.
This is your responsibility, right? And so now we're talking about Sarah. What is Sarah going to do? Sarah is going to say, I need a cross-functional perspective on this. I'm going to call my 5 friends in the organization, somebody from product, somebody from data science team, somebody who's in sales, somebody who does sort of maybe customer success or something, that person who works with the end users a lot. I'm going to get them together, and we're going to sit around a table, and we're going to think about the risks associated with this. You can call it, I'm going to call that a risk assessment. You can just call it, you're sitting around to talk about the risks. And there's a structured way of doing it. And basically, you just sit around and you start thinking about the ways in which your system could be misused or potentially go wrong or harm people. Start documenting that, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's your first risk assessment. It may not be perfect, but get it on the books that you've thought about these risks. Write it down. Think about all, and in the same way, because people worry about discoverability and all sorts of things like this. Also talk about all the ways that you're doing good things currently to protect people, right? Document that
Oh,
stuff as well, right? Get that on paper. Um, and then the next step is to say, okay, now you've assembled the Avengers, Sarah. We're talking about Sarah still.
right.
What does this group need in order to effectively govern this process? It needs a remit, which means what are we actually able to do? What's our scope, right? Get that from ideally there's some C-suite buy-in for
Right.
this, and then get a minimal set of policies and procedures. So we've talked about the risks. What are the things we need to track about our system, monitor? What is the cadence at which we need to meet? And what are the triggers for potentially doing this risk assessment again? Maybe we get a big new client. Maybe we've retrained the model. Maybe we've changed our business plan, or or something like this. We've opened up to a new market. What are the triggers that need us to revisit this possibility of risk?
Hmm.
Get those on paper. At a little bit before that, what are the principles at which we're going to evaluate these things? So what are, based on our corporate values, what are the set of sort of principles that we are going to maximize when we're trying to make decisions? Like, how important is transparency to us? And
Oh,
what do we mean by transparency? What does fairness mean for our business? What is integrity or robustness or accuracy of the system? What are we trying to maximize for? Get those on paper as well.
mm,
And if you do that, and then of course the technical stuff will come after. The data scientist is going to be, oh, we need to probably monitor. Let's figure out if we can have a proxy for some sort of demographic information so we can monitor fairness and that kind of thing. The things will naturally flow from that. But I think having that first step of like find the accountable person, have them assemble a cross-functional team, do an initial risk landscape assessment, and start coming up with these policies and procedures, it's going to get you kind of 60% of the way towards a lot of these requirements anyway, and it's
sure.
going to just get you to wrap your head around where you need to be to start actually mitigating these risks.
Right. And then you can kind of fill it in. And then also doing it that way also makes it highly adaptable for the changing landscape, right? Because this
Yeah,
landscape is going to be changing
yeah, yeah,
you know,
yeah. I mean,
forever, probably.
monitoring regulations, monitoring in your industry. What are the big news stories? What's happening? What are other people experiencing in terms of risk or problems? Can you avoid those? the problem is this is resource intensive, right? So this is not an easy lift for a small organization,
Right.
but there is a kind of minimum viable product, which is what I just described, which if you haven't done it yet, you have to start doing it. And it might be that you need to get outside help. But if you can get the headspace and the people in the same room to be thinking clearly about this, I'm willing to bet that you'd be able to come up with all sorts of ways in which you can be better at managing those risks. And don't let the perfect be what's the idiom that everybody uses? The
Oh,
enemy of the good or something like that. Well, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. I don't know.
right. I don't remember it either, but I know what you mean. Yeah, we're not
Yeah.
don't
Um,
strive for protection or for perfection out of the gates. And
yeah.
well, and
Yeah.
what's interesting about what you propose too is that you're built within it is like at least triggers that you can sort of anticipate. Obviously you might not be able to think about all the triggers, but you're like, if this happens, then because then it's like, okay, we have this framework, and I think it happens a lot in businesses. You build a framework and then it just collects dust in some folder somewhere because because you don't have that. You don't have that moment of, oh, this thing has happened and we have someone accountable who's, oh, this thing has happened and someone's accountable. So, at least you have not only the beginnings of a, sort of set of frameworks, but you also have those two things, right? The
Yeah.
accountability trigger to when you might use it, and someone who is responsible for doing that. So,
Yeah, good point. I mean, definitely keeping it from collecting dust is important. Like, because it can grow when things get busy. Especially with any kind of business organization like you. It's easy to let things go to the wayside if it's not, right up front in your face.
right.
But it
Yeah.
will be, and it creeps up on you, and so having those sort of regular cadence for these sorts of things or trigger events is useful for keeping on your toes.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Interesting. Well, what a great conversation. I like am so intrigued to keep seeing how it progresses and evolves. And, I would love to stay in touch and hear about how things are going in your world as you're on the ground doing these things, because I think it's just so I share your sentiment. I'm very passionate about um being responsible with what we do. And as being someone who's building these things, I think I find it very difficult when I find myself in a situation, which I found myself in a couple times, where it's like, hey, I'm not even going to tackle that project because I don't see how we can even, um, it doesn't even meet the minimum bar.
Yeah.
Everything we're talking, most things don't fit that quite into that category, but um, it is difficult, and then it's difficult for me to think about it in my own little bubble. And then I'm not a lawyer. I'm not, that's a totally different type of framework to be working with. And so, all that to say, I'm just very excited that this is becoming a bigger thing and more important and a higher focus. So I'm really glad we were able to dive into it a little bit more.
Yeah, no, thank you, and I'm always happy to talk about it. I think we're going to see it. It's going to progress to the point where it will be standard business practices, just like everything. It's going to get incorporated into every business's sort of must-have in terms of
Yeah.
what they need to think about, and then we can worry about the details above that. But it won't be long, I think, before it becomes pervasive.
Yeah, I mean, that's what it looks like from where I'm at too. So yeah, it's kind of exciting. Well, thank you so much for the time today, and thank you everyone for taking the time to listen in.
Yeah, thank
Um,
you.
yeah.
All right, have a good day.